Paranormal Scary True Story number 1. The Basement Ouija Board. When I was 16, this happened. I am now 28 years old. I never talked about this to anyone except for those that were present when this happened. This experience has scared me, and the events that took place will stick with me until the day I die. When I was a teenager, I never really talked to anyone outside of my family, and I grew up in a small town in Italy, which was completely isolated and surrounded by mountains. Being a small village, everyone knew each other. This, in particular day, was my cousin's birthday. News around the area does travel fast, so there were a lot of people there already when I got there. When I arrived, there were people jumping off the roofs into the pool. They were drinking, smoking, the usual stuff at parties. After the party died down, my cousins and I, along with a couple of her friends, stayed for a while longer. My cousin then pulled out an old Ouija board that my aunt had bought for her on holiday while she was in the United States. Back then, I really wasn't a believer of a ghost or paranormal, and I would usually make stupid remarks regarding the paranormal. But what happened that night changed everything. At that moment, I didn't believe that some board could contact anything from the afterlife. We all sat down in the living room in front of the sofa and set everything up. I got this gut feeling that something wasn't quite right about this board. I was half tempted to just throw it in the trash. When everything was ready, I was the first one to ask a question. I said, "Can you give me a haircut?" It was as a joke, just to break the tension. But the girl started getting angry at me and chastising me, and said that I could get lost if I'm not going to take this seriously. I said, "Screw this, that I'm out of here." But before I could leave, my cousin said, "But wait, can you just stop being an ass and just go along with it? It's my birthday after all." After feeling a little guilty, I reluctantly sat back down and watched them move the planchette from letter to letter. I ended up dozing off when suddenly I was snapped back to reality by my cousin screaming. She screamed so loud that I bet every single person outside of that house could hear it. I sat up and saw that she was crying, and then I noticed that her arm had been scratched. At first, I thought they were just messing with me, but then I noticed that my cousin was scared out of her mind. "I'm throwing this damn thing out," I said, as I picked up the board and threw it to the open basement door. It landed on the bottom of the steps. I then asked the girls what had happened. They said it scratched her. While I was sitting on the floor dozing off, something evil scratched my cousin. The girls then walked my cousin to her bedroom, leaving me by myself. After staring at the open basement door for a while, I decided to call it a night. I grabbed some snacks from the kitchen and sat down to watch TV. At about 2:30 in the morning, I started to get really sleepy, so I stretched out on the couch and closed my eyes. But after a few moments, I heard these painful scratching sounds, like long steel nails being dragged across wood. I got up and made my way to where the sound was coming from. I hadn't realized it, but I found myself at the basement doorway again. I opened it without a second thought, but the moment I did, there was nothing. It was just a dark, silent, motionless basement. I was way too tired for this, so I made my way to my cousin's bedroom. But to my absolute astonishment, the three of them were all sitting on the floor in a circle, moving the planchette across the Ouija board. "Really? You're messing with that thing after what just happened?" I said to them. They all looked up at me, but before anyone could respond, we all heard a loud cracking sound coming from the hallway. I had rushed back into the room that I had just come from. The basement door was completely destroyed, as if someone had smashed it right off its hinges, sending the pieces down the basement steps. We rushed to the basement doorway. I said, "Everyone stay behind me. We'll all go down together. I had grabbed a candle that was resting on the dresser next to the doorway and had one of the girls light it up. Together, we all just descended the creaky steps, but as soon as we got to the bottom, I got this awful feeling that something was down there with us, something evil. Don't ask me how, but I somehow knew that something was on the ceiling right above us. I was scared to look up, but I knew that I had to. The dim candle light revealed a dark shadow-like form above us. It clung to the ceiling like a spider. I then saw its horrifying face staring right back at me. I fell backwards and said, "Everyone, get the hell out of here now." I led the girls back up the stairs and into my cousin's bedroom. After a while of pressing against the locked door of the room that we were in, and my heart beating out of my chest and listening to my cousin's cry, I then slowly sat down against the door and dozed off. Looking back at it was a dumb decision to stay in that house. To this day, I still haven't gotten an explanation of how the Ouija board went from the bottom of the basement steps to my cousin's bedroom. I am now a firm believer in the paranormal. Paranormal Scary True Story number 2, the Ouija board. These events took place in the summer of 2014, and I had just graduated from high school. I was enjoying my summer vacation before I had to set off to college. I really didn't have too many friends. Among the few that I did have was Phil, a pretty close friend of mine. I had a hobby of going to garage sales, and whenever I would see a sign, I would usually rush to it. I don't ever look for anything in particular. I just see if anything catches my eye, and if it's within my price range, I will most likely get it. So when I stumbled upon an old Ouija board one day, I got pretty excited. I have heard about people using Ouija boards to communicate with spirits, but I wasn't sure if the whole thing was real or not. So after bringing home the Ouija board, I called up Phil to see if we could try it out and if he was down for it. And we waited until my parents and my sister were out of the house. My family went out to eat that night, and I told them that I really didn't feel like going out and wanted to get some rest. So around 8 o'clock, they left, and about 30 minutes later, Phil was at my door. We wasted no time in setting everything up. Now at this point, both me and Phil had no idea. Both me and Phil had no dead relatives that we had known personally to contact, so we both just wanted to see if we could communicate with any wandering ghosts. So once the lights were off and the candles were lit, Phil started to get hesitant. He said, "Are you sure we should be doing this? What if we get possessed or something?" That's when I told him, "Come on, don't be a puss. This is our chance to find out if this thing actually works." That's when he hesitantly placed his hand on the planchette. I then placed mine. I then asked if anyone was here. The planchette then slowly moved to the word yes. Phil asked me, "You're not moving it, are you?" I then told him no, that I was not. "Are you a good spirit?" I then asked. The planchette then slowly moved to the word no. I then looked at Phil's face, and he looked as if he was getting a panic attack. "I told you this was a bad idea," Phil said. Looking back, he was correct. Despite him saying this, I made a really dumb decision by continuing the game. I told him to just calm down, and nothing happened so far. Let's just see what it has to say. I then asked the spirit directly, "What do you want?" The planchette then spelled out a message, "Your lives." All of a sudden, the candles blew out and the room went dark. That's when I heard a strange thump right next to us. I bolted for the light switch and switched it on, and what I saw next chilled me to the bone. Near inches from Phil's head was a fork embedded into the wall behind him. It was the same fork I had used earlier and tossed it into the sink. Phil turned and looked at it and went crazy. "Screw this, man. I knew this was a bad idea from the beginning. I'm out of here," Phil said. I didn't stop him. In fact, I couldn't even move. I just sat there looking at the fork in the wall in disbelief. After hearing the door slam, I remembered that my family would be home anytime. So I quickly put the board back into the box. I put the candles back in their usual spots, and I finally unstuck the fork from the wall and threw it back into the sink. Once I was in bed is when my mind began to race, and I started to wonder, did all that really just happen? Did we actually make contact with something? I finally then fell asleep. Shortly after, I did not know what time it was, but I woke up on my backside. The only lighting that was coming into the room was the moonlight. I tried to flip back onto my side, only to realize that I could not even move. I kept trying, but my body would not budge. I admittedly became unsettled. I've never experienced sleep paralysis before, yet here I was, still as a statue, unable to move, not even 1 inch. It was then that I was able to look around the room, and what I saw petrified me to the core, and I will never forget it to this day. In front of my sliding closet doors was a black human-like mass. The figure was way too thin to be my father. Once my eyes adjusted to the lighting, I saw more detail. It was about 9 feet tall. Its eyes were 2 red circles. Whatever it was unearthly and terrifying. It was definitely not human. Just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, it began to move towards me and slowly approach me, stopping at the foot of my bed. Its arms began to stretch, extending to the floor. I then saw its arms slowly creeping up on the side of the bed next to me. I still couldn't move. I was unable to do anything. I could only watch in terror as its arms began to wrap around my forearms like a snake, squeezing me. I stared into its red eyes as its jaws began to open. The last thing I remember is the thing leaping forward onto the bed. I finally jolted awake, letting out the loudest scream that I could possibly utter. It was only after my family burst into my room that I realized that I could move again. My mother immediately came to check on me as my father and sister stared at me from the doorway. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the morning came, I called Phil and told him everything that happened. It turns out he had the same nightmare as me. However, in his, the creature did not attack him. We both concluded that what we contacted that night was extremely hostile entity. We both knew what had to be done. He came back later that afternoon, and we threw the board into the fire pit and burned it until there was nothing left. Ever since then, neither of us has had another encounter. So my message to all those that are listening is, do not mess with Ouija boards.
Number 1. My clairvoyance.
I am a 27-year-old female, and ever since I was a little girl, I've been able to see things that others can't. Whenever someone tells you something like that, it most likely means that they probably had a hard time growing up. Children with this gift simply don't understand their sensitivity to energies and how to safeguard against them. Having parents that are either closed off to the paranormal or simply won't accept it can even be harder. I shared that information with you to illustrate that this encounter wasn't my first experience with ghosts or entities. I was a teenager back then, and I was hanging out with my then good-for-nothing boyfriend. I don't remember what we were talking about when the topic got brought up, but he said, "I don't know what happened here before we moved in, but this place is definitely haunted, babe. I always get this creeped out feeling when I'm upstairs, like somebody's watching me." I never really talked to my ex about my gift with the paranormal, so I was a bit intrigued when he said this. After showing me around the house, I could sense the spirit wandering in the upstairs hallway before it disappeared in the bedroom. The second time I encountered this so-called spirit was the night of his sister's baby shower. His family came traveling in from far away that night. A fight had broke out because they had a disagreement and couldn't work things out. At that time, I walked upstairs and grabbed something from the bedroom. The upstairs hallway light was off because the bulb kept burning out. Every time it would get replaced, the bulb would wind up blowing out days after. Due to it not being replaced, I had to use my phone's flashlight to get around. I got what I came for and was heading back towards the stairwell when all of a sudden I got this feeling that I was being watched by something very angry. I stopped for a moment, looking back down the hallway, trying to tell if I was just being paranoid or something was actually there. Then, out of the shadows, an angry-looking man came charging right at me. Now, I pride myself in not being easily scared, but at that moment, I took off. I knew that what I saw was 100% paranormal. The man I saw looked like he was incomplete. He was missing pieces from his face with other parts blurred out. This ghostly man must have been angry about something. All that built up negative energy can be very dangerous even to somebody like me, who can see the paranormal with no problems at all. I could have just forgot about it, but I told myself that the apparition appeared because of all the fighting that occurred downstairs when his family came over that one night. This was the first time in a very long time that I had seen anything that frightened me. A few nights later, I showed up at my ex-boyfriend's house and once again found myself at the top of the stairs looking down. His bedroom is also located in the hallway, so as I walked to the door, I noticed that the bathroom light was on. It wasn't uncommon for him to leave the light on, but the door was also slightly cracked, casting a triangular shape on the carpet. I then saw something standing there, which blocked the light coming through. At first, I thought it was my boyfriend, so I opened the door. At first, I thought it was him, so I opened the door. My happy smile quickly faded. I realized no one was there. I ran to the bedroom and opened his door. There was my ex on his bed, on his phone. He said, "Let me guess, you saw something in the bathroom, just like I did." He told me the night prior, after leaving the restroom, the door made a noise. When he turned around, he saw that the restroom door had closed all the way by itself. When he opened it, he saw an apparition standing looking at itself in the mirror. It then slowly turned towards him. He exclaims that it was a man, an older man, who looked really angry. He bolted to his bedroom, closed the door, and eventually forgot about it. We eventually went about our night, but I couldn't get over what I saw that night. My ex and I weren't together much longer after that night, and his family never came by to visit that house. I've been told by two different psychics that I have a dark entity attached to me, following me wherever I go. After the breakup, a lot of things in my life changed. I've always wondered if whatever was inside his house attached itself to me. But who really knows? Whenever I'm alone, I can feel the ghostly entity staring at me. I don't know who he was, but I have an idea that he was a miserable man when he was alive, full of hate and anger. What's left of him now tries to torment anyone who crosses his path. But again, that's just my thoughts. I've seen his face so many times that I can accurately draw him on a piece of paper. I plan on talking to someone who knows the history of this town and perhaps can help me find out who exactly this ghostly entity was.
Scary, true paranormal story number 2. My grandfather.
Hi, my mother told me this true story. She said in 2004, my grandfather passed away from lung cancer, which devastated the whole family, especially my grandmother. I was only a few months old at the time of his passing, so I never got to know him, but I've always heard stories about him from various relatives. They said while he was alive, he was a good man. A few weeks after the funeral, my mother had been driving back home from the store with my older brother in the car, who was 3 years old at the time. As they were on their way back home, my brother said out of nowhere, "Mommy, I saw Grandpa." This caught her off guard, and all she could do was listen. "Grandpa was in my room." My mother remained silent the rest of the way home. I don't think she believed him at first. A few months later, she was in the living room, while I was on the floor playing with my toys. My mother went into the kitchen to grab a snack for me. A few seconds later, she heard me giggling. Stepping back into the room, she playfully asked me, "What are you laughing about, honey?" What she saw, however, made her pause. I was still laughing while my hands were in the air, as if someone was going to pick me up, but nobody was there. My mom quickly scooped me up in her arms and took me to the kitchen. The last occurrence happened a year later. My grandmother had been staying with us for a few weeks, and at one point my grandfather was brought up into the conversation, and my grandmother began to cry. She was still having it hard, coping with his death. My brother, who at this time was 4 years old, told my grandmother, "Grandpa said that everything will be okay." So this compelled my mother to rush down the hallway to my brother's room to see who may be in there that he's been talking to. She swears up and down that as she entered the room, a dark, ghostly figure was standing in his room, surrounded by a strange light. When my mother called out for us to come in the room to look at the figure, and the light vanished from plain sight. When she got back to the kitchen, she tried to explain that nothing was wrong. She didn't want to upset my grandmother even more. There were no further occurrences after that day. To this day, my mother is convinced that the spirit of her father was watching over us until my grandmother finally accepted his passing over. Only then did his spirit move on. Strangely enough, I believe my mother, she wouldn't joke or lie about something like this. I did want to end this by saying that I'm not a very superstitious person, but I do believe that the dead never truly leave us. There is always some part of them that stays behind, reminding us that they are never gone.
The Ouija board ghost.
Many people have Ouija boards sitting in their closet, somewhere collecting dust. Most people have never even used a Ouija board. I found out what Ouija boards were when I was 16, and when I asked my parents if we had one in our house, my mom told us yes, she did have one, buried somewhere in the closet with all the other board games. That closet was located in the basement. It was a small closet with a bunch of my parents' old stuff. I was pretty intrigued in using a Ouija board because I was kind of superstitious. I was able to dig through the closet without making a mess or displacing anything. Eventually, I found the old dusty box that just said Ouija on it and a planchette that moves around the board. The box was kind of falling apart on the edges, even though my mom said they've only used it once or twice. The first thing I did was text a few of my friends to come use the Ouija board with me that weekend when we'd be home alone to make it scarier. My friend Ed, who was 16, had a car, so he picked up another friend of mine, Dan, and they came right over to my house. It was already pretty late, I would say about 10 o'clock p.m. It definitely was dark outside. My parents were going to be gone for a couple of nights, and my younger brother Adam, of 12 years old, was home. So I asked him if he wanted to join as well. We were all going to play on the floor in the loft area, which was converted to my bedroom. We turned off the lights and turned on a flashlight and put it on the floor in the corner of the room, pointed toward the board. All four of us sat on one side of the board, and we held the planchette and started asking questions. We asked basic questions. I said, "If there's somebody here, please move the planchette." Then, for the first time, it started to move. It slowly moved to the word yes. Adam asked, "How old are you?" And the planchette moved to the number 6, then to the number 7, 67. We looked at each other, and I suspected one of them were moving it. I'm sure the others did too. We all played along and just kept going with it. Eventually, I asked the board, "Are you a demon?" And the planchette slowly moved to the word yes. At this point, we all laughed, knowing one of us was messing around. But then, suddenly, at that moment, the flashlight turned off, and that's when all of us stopped laughing and got really scared. "Who did that?" someone asked. but it was clearly none of us. You see, the flashlight was all the way in the corner of the room. I crawled over to get it and kept pressing the button to turn it back on. It wouldn't turn back on. That's when I hurried over to turn on my bedside lamp. After I turned on my lamp, that's when I saw the freaked out expressions on my friends' faces and on my brother's face as well. I told them that was the most terrifying moment for the battery to die. But also, part of me believed it wasn't a coincidence. We stopped playing after that moment, and we left my room and went to the backyard just because we all were freaked out being in the house at that moment. The scariest thought was I knew I had to sleep in that room that night. After my friends left and Adam eventually went to sleep, I went back to my room. I put the Ouija board back in the box and brought it downstairs out of my room. I just felt weird sleeping in the same room with the board that night. As soon as I turned off the light, I just tried to go to sleep right away, not sitting on my phone for an hour like I usually do. As I was starting to finally drift off and fall asleep, something in my closet fell over. I immediately rose up and looked in the direction of the closet door. I flicked on the bedside lamp and walked over to the closet. It was a small walk-in closet where I keep some of my clothes. There's a light switch on the outside of the closet that turned on the light inside the closet. I didn't want to open the closet door, so I turned the light on to the closet and just looked at the bottom of the closet door. And that's when I noticed 2 feet that casted shadows on the other side of the door. I stood still and didn't move or make a sound. I kept watching the shadows. Then they slowly moved forward, and that's when I screamed. I ran to Adam's room and I explained to him what I just saw and led him to my room to show him. When I came to my room, the light in the closet was still on, but the shadows at the bottom of the door weren't there anymore. I opened the door and there was nobody in the closet, but there was something on the floor. It was a wooden box that I made in arts and crafts class that I would put my childhood memorabilia in. It somehow fell over and the contents spilled onto the floor. There was no draft in the world that would have knocked that over. It made no sense at all. I slept in my parents' bed that night, and then the next, and for a week after that, I slept in the spare bedroom. Eventually, after a while, I did start sleeping in my own bed again, but I would never forget that night. I haven't touched a Ouija board ever since. True, scary, paranormal story number 2, the Amazon Ouija board. In October of 2016, when I was a sophomore in high school, I was in a phase where I was obsessed with everything scary and supernatural. Halloween was also coming up. I also read a lot of scary stories about Ouija boards and people's experiences with them. I finally ordered a Ouija board off of Amazon, and when it arrived, I waited till it was at night when our parents were not home to use it. I convinced my little sister to try it with me. We were at the dining room table with the lights dimmed, and both of us were holding the planchette. I asked some random questions, and my sister and I both laughed because it was kind of awkward and funny using this for the first time. I started to move the planchette around, trying to creep out my sister, but she knew it was me doing it. After a few minutes of doing this, we got bored, and my sister wanted to stop. I said, let's try just for a few more minutes. After a little bit more waiting for the planchette to move from some unseen entity, we decided to give up. After this, we both went to our rooms. That's when I got on my bed, turned off my light, and I looked up more Ouija board stories online. I kept reading people's experiences with them, and then I looked up why it didn't work for us. Other people had said their first time using Ouija boards, nothing happened either. So I decided to try it again later on that night, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning. When my sister was already asleep, I went back down to the dining room table and dimmed the lights again. I once again tried to use the Ouija board, asking similar questions as a few hours ago, but just in a lower voice to try not to wake up my sister. I held the planchette with both hands, waiting for it to move, but it never did. Instead, I heard sounds from upstairs, like soft footsteps. I thought to myself, it could have been my sister. She might have heard me down here. The footsteps were followed by a muffled female voice, but it didn't quite sound like my sister's though, and the voice was coming from directly above me. The room above, the dining room, was our older brother's room, who was away at college. My sister wouldn't have been in there. She knows she's not allowed in that room. I was curious if my sister was playing a prank on me and made her voice to sound lower just to scare me. I went upstairs and I got to my brother's door and I put my ear up against it. That's when I was terrified to the core. What I heard gives me chills to this day. I heard the voice of an older woman. I wasn't sure how my sister could be doing a voice like that. At first, I didn't know what was being said until I realized that the voice kept saying, "Grandma's here, Georgie," over and over. That's when I realized it was the voice of my dead grandma. I felt every hair on my body stand up. It took every ounce of courage just to open the door, but I opened it, and I turned on the light, and no one was inside the room. The voice had stopped. That's when I ran to my room and shut the door and locked it. I curled up under the covers. I felt the whole room spinning as I couldn't form any rational thoughts of what just happened. It was too vivid for me to have imagined it. When I finally calmed down, I did a prayer before going to sleep. I pretty much was awake all night. Even though this was 8 years ago, I still remember this as if it was last night.
My mom's doppelganger.
I have an open mind, but I don't buy into things that easily. Most things that happen, I blame on my mind, playing tricks on me, or sleep deprivation, or simply the fact that it could be a mental illness. There is one moment though, or I suppose a few moments, that have been on my mind for some time now. While I was in the shower one day, and as water poured over my head, I heard my brother yell my name. "Stacy. Stacy." The second time was louder than the first, as if something was wrong. I could have sworn I heard my dog barking as well at the same time. Annoyed but concerned, I got out and cracked the door open, then called back to him, but after waiting a few seconds there was no response. I quickly dried myself off and put on my robe, then headed downstairs asking what he needed. However, I still got no response. My dog was on her bed, fast asleep, and my brother was nowhere to be found. I looked out the window, and their car wasn't even there. This wasn't the first time my mind has decided to play these annoying games, so I didn't really think much of it. I've had auditory hallucinations before, none to that degree, but maybe they're getting worse, I thought. That's my way of trying to reason with myself, and it worked. The next time that I heard my brother yell my name calling for me loudly, I thought I was genuinely going crazy. I decided to bring it up to my brother while playing Borderlands one night. We talked about our mental health a lot because our parents don't believe in therapy, so we kind of became each other's safe haven. I explained everything that's happened over the past month, and instead of giving advice or sympathizing like he usually does, he just gets really quiet for a second until he says that he's been having the same experiences as me. Except it's been our mom yelling his name, but she's never even home when it happens. He goes to check and no one's there. This was about a month ago or two, but he also thought his mind was playing tricks on him. It seemed after that talk things began to stop. I didn't hear anything for almost 3 weeks, but then something happened that I'll never forget to this very day, and I will probably never have an explanation for what it was. I was sitting in my bed, in my room scrolling through Instagram, when my mom starts aggressively calling my name from downstairs. I've never heard her voice before. It was always my brother's, so I didn't even think anything weird of it. I was about to get up and see what she wanted, when suddenly my mom burst through the door asking me what I wanted. I didn't know what to say, but I could tell that she was annoyed by the look she gave me. She asked me again what I wanted, and I just shook my head trying to understand what was going on. Then she angrily sighed and said not to yell her name while she's making dinner, and she walked out, leaving the door open. Still in shock, I got up to close the door, but as I walked across the room, my heart stopped when I came to the realization, and I immediately ran over to the window and looked at my driveway. My mom was at work, and the car wasn't even there. I locked my door to my room and jumped on my bed. Again, there was banging on my door. I sat on my bed crying as I called my brother. I was absolutely petrified and wanted to get out of the house, but couldn't even get myself to go downstairs alone, knowing that whatever that thing was out there. My brother didn't pick up as he was at work, so I was left stuck there. I ended up locking myself in my small bathroom while I waited for either my brother or my mom to get home from work, though I knew it would be hours. Thankfully, nothing else happened until my mom got back home. I told my brother that night, and he said he never had anything like that happen to him that bad. To this day, I still have no answers as to what I was hearing and seeing, but honestly, I'm writing this and sharing it to everyone just to be able to forget about it and move on.
Scary, true, paranormal story number 2, my childhood home.
This occurred when I was about 8 years old. My childhood home had a lot of issues with its past. A lot of deaths happened in the house prior to my family moving in. Most recently, the people that were renting it out to my mom and stepdad didn't want to live there because their son decided to opt out of life. And before that, a few murders even happened at the house. We didn't know the details, but that's what the landlord told us. I was young when my mom met my stepdad, and shortly after they met, they moved in together. My paranormal experiences didn't come until my baby sister came along, and that's when everything started. The house had 2 bedrooms, so I had to share a room with my baby sister, Rye. My little sister would never stop crying, and when I was young, I absolutely could not stand her. I remember this one night that I will never forget. She was crying for hours, and all of a sudden, she completely stopped. The room was dark, but I had a nightlight, so I could see a little around the room. I looked over, and I saw this shadowy figure hovering over her crib. It didn't move much, but when it did, it was slow and misty. I was petrified and hid under the covers until I eventually fell asleep. I told my parents the next day. They thought it was just my imagination. This happened so many more times of just waking up and seeing the figure by my sister's crib. It was nowhere else in the room. After a while of complaining about it, I ended up sleeping in my parents' room with my mom, while my stepdad slept in my room. But a lot more continued to happen. Shortly after I started seeing this figure, my stepdad lost his job. He was a hardworking man, so it really shocked my mom when it happened. He went through a rough depression because he really loved his job, and losing it must have been really hard on him. I remember him sitting on the couch all day, every day, just watching TV. One day, when I got home from school, I came in and saw him sitting on the couch, and a dark figure was standing right behind him. I remember it so clearly, just standing behind the couch. I didn't know what to do, so I just began to cry. My stepdad got up really quick and took me to the room to calm me down. When my mom came home, I told my parents that night of what I saw. Again, my stepdad seemed disinterested, but my mom seemed a little sympathetic. But no one really believed me. After that, there were a few good weeks where nothing happened, followed by weeks of this figure hanging around, usually either by Rye or my stepdad. Some nights, when I slept in my room, I'd hear a voice. It was a woman's voice. It was real deep, just talking to Rye. I never understood the words coming from it, but it terrified me every time. As Rye got older and began to walk and talk, I noticed she spent a lot more time in that room talking to her so-called friend, the Dark Shadow. I knew what it was. The more this figure seemed to hang around, the worse the emotions in the house got. My sister would seem to never talk to anyone else. My mom had so much anger inside of her, and my stepdad was always depressed, and I was alone all the time. Then my parents started fighting all the time, screaming things at each other. My mom hated my stepdad for not keeping down a job, and my stepdad was just a depressed mess. They seemed to fight every single night, and every night it got worse. While in my room, I even heard my stepdad telling my mom to put the knife down. But the worst time of all was when I was in the living room watching TV. It wasn't that late, maybe 8:30 p.m. or so, and my stepdad was asleep on the couch while my mom was in her room. I was starting to get tired, and I turned off the TV and walked upstairs to my room. At the top of the stairs, though, I started to hear whispering, followed by speaking back to the whispers. The door was cracked open a few inches, and I slowly walked over to look inside. Just a couple of steps away from the door, I walked over to the door, and I looked inside, and that's when I saw a figure, and that's when I could see Rye next to this figure, as if it was trying to lead her somewhere. I screamed, and instantly the door slammed by itself. I just stood there screaming and crying before my mom rushed out of the room. I just pointed at the door, unable to make out any words. She tried to open it, but it was locked. It was one of those cheaper ones, though, so where she could use her fingernail to open it. She pushed it open, and Rye was in the corner of the room facing the wall. My mom yelled at her for locking the door, even though Rye was way too short to reach the doorknob. Rye didn't have any sort of reaction on her face. After that, I fell into a small depression, along with what seemed like the rest of the family. No one talked to each other. I became the one taking care of my baby sister. Me and the strange figure I became familiar with. It even started hanging around my bed during nights when I was extra sad, and it brought me a sort of weird comfort, knowing that I wasn't alone. Eventually, my mom had enough of my dad, and we left to stay with my grandparents. I remember her telling us to pack up, and as we headed to the car, I saw the figure again, standing right behind my dad. I felt sad leaving him, but at least he wouldn't truly be alone.
The church entity.
My name is Lana, and I'm finally ready to talk about what happened to me in the summer of 2019. I had just turned 16 that November, and I was ecstatic. I could finally get my driver's license, and that was my first step to freedom. After my birthday had passed, the summer finally came around. In the summer, there were plenty of camps I could have attended. The one that I finally set my mind on was called United Methodist Camp. Basically, what you would do was you went for a week Sunday through Saturday, and during that time you worked all day building things, usually wheelchair ramps for the elderly or disabled. It was generally a fun experience until Wednesday rolled around, the day we started the unusual waking up at 6 a.m. At 11, all the teams, including mine, would head out and start on the wheelchair ramps. We usually were able to finish a ramp in about 2 days. So Wednesday was my team's second day working on this particular ramp. We finished up at around 3 in the afternoon. So my counselors and the rest of my team headed back to the church that we were staying at. I should probably clarify the living situation. The boys stayed in a separate building, and the girls stayed in the basement of the church. I'm not sure about the boys' rooms, but the girls were put into a room down in the basement that was originally used as a Sunday school classroom. There were 2 pictures hanging on the wall of Mary and a picture of Jesus. That Wednesday night, we all laid down to go to sleep. There was a girl named Sydney who was laying down across the room, and she started saying things like, "We should tell scary stories." We all asked her to go to sleep. Sydney proceeded to knock on the wall behind her, saying, "What if we get a knock back from the other side of the wall?" After about 5 minutes, the room was dead silent. We all figured that Sydney had passed out, so one by one, we all drifted off to sleep. I was laying on the opposite side of the room from Sydney, and I was facing the pictures of Mary and Jesus. After everyone had fallen asleep, I was still awake, just laying there in silence. Finally, my eyes became very heavy, and I laid my head down on the blow-up mattress. Suddenly, I heard this tiny knock coming from the wall behind us. The knock was quiet enough for only me to hear, but just loud enough to wake me out of my tired state. I then looked at the pictures that faced me on the other side of the room. I then sat up in bed in a state of terror. What I saw will forever haunt me to this day. I saw a tall, faceless figure leaning down, staring at me. The thing was so tall it had to bend its extremely skinny neck to look at me, with its featureless face. I was frozen in fear. I couldn't move or scream. The figure started to bend its neck down towards me. What felt like an eternity of laying there watching this freakish thing move closer to me. A light flashed in the room from someone's phone, and it snapped me out of my trance. I jumped to my feet and dove into the bed of one of my friends. I stayed there with her for the rest of the night, with my head under the covers. I cried until I finally passed out from exhaustion. When I woke up that morning, I acted everything was normal. I was terrified about what I saw, but if I said anything to anyone, they would have thought that I was going nuts, so I kept it to myself. My counselor kept asking me if it was okay. She told me later on that she caught me staring off into space and silently crying throughout the day, which I have no memory of. I really wish this was the end of the story, but to my dismay, it is not. When night came, the girls had gotten into a fight about something, and this resulted in their moving into different rooms. My best friend Milani and myself were the only ones left in the room with the pictures. I was absolutely terrified to go to sleep in the room again, since it was just me and only one other person. As we were settling down for the night, my youth director, Rose, who was a close friend of ours, walked into our room and talked to us for a while. Suddenly, we heard an ear-piercing scream echo through the basement. It came from one of the other rooms the girls had moved into. The three of us rushed into the hallway to see what was happening. The girls ran out of the room and were absolutely hysterical. One of them grabbed me and said, "He's here, the devil's here." I then made my way into the room that the girls had just fled, and I felt a dark presence lurking there. When I looked to the corner of the room, I could see the same dark figure that I had saw the night before. I then turned around and left the room as quickly as I could. One of the girls were finally able to tell us that something had grabbed one of them, and a moaning sound could be heard in the room. I'm not sure if the girls actually saw something, but I put two and two together and concluded that there was something evil residing within that church. And that night it showed itself to me for some unknown reason.
The walking cheetah. Now, I heard this story about 5 years ago, and after finding out that it was 100% true, I decided to put this in my stories. I was a mechanic in the 1960s, and I was about 19 years old, and I had just gotten done working late on some cars at the shop. I was really tired, and it was about 9 o'clock p.m. I remember saying goodbye to the owner of the shop and getting into my car. I don't know if many people know about the Bridgewater Triangle, but it's known to be a very paranormal hotspot. I don't live in it, but I did have to drive through it every day to and from work on one of the main highways. I remember that I was truly tired that night, and I just wanted to get home. I was driving down the highway, and it was surrounded by woods on both sides. It took me about 15 minutes to get home, and at this time I was already about 5 minutes into my drive when I noticed that the light above my head started flickering. I didn't pay much attention to it, and I kept driving. Then my car started shaking. I was confused. Then it completely stalled out, and I was surprised because I always kept up with my car. I pulled over to the side of the road, and I got out of the car with my flashlight in my hand, and I slowly walked over to the hood of the car and opened it. I couldn't find anything wrong with the engine. That's when I heard a noise in the woods to the left of me, but I couldn't see anything, and I started to get really scared at this point. I wanted to fix the problem and get out of there, so I got back in the car and I tried starting it again, but it didn't want to start. So I went back under the hood for a second time. As I flashed my light at the engine, trying to find where the problem was coming from, is when something huge knocked me down to the ground. I fell straight down, flat on my back. My flashlight rolled away from me, and I couldn't see anything. I just felt something on top of me. Whatever was on me was scratching me and punching my face over and over. It was also cursing at me and saying horrible things. I just remember screaming for my dear life. This thing had a musky smell. I reached over with one of my arms and tried to push it off, and with the other arm, I grabbed the flashlight and I started hitting this thing that was on me. I finally got a good look at what was on me, and what I saw terrified me to the core. It was a creature with a cheetah's face and small antlers. Its eyes were glowing red, and it was covered in black fur. It had huge claws. Just when I thought I was going to die, I saw headlights coming down the highway, and it shined right on me and the creature that was laying on top of me. This creature then stopped punching me and scratching me and looked at the headlights. It then stood up and ran into the woods. I couldn't get off the ground. I was traumatized, and I was trying to catch my breath. I turned my head to the right, and I remember staring at the car that was parked in front of me, and a man came out of the car and walked up to me. He asked me if I was okay, and I told him that I was, and that did he get a good look at what was on me. He said that it looked like a cheetah, but all that changed when he said it ran back into the woods on its hind legs like a human. I am now 64 years old, and I would never second guess my story. It really did happen to me, and I'll never forget it. Story number 2, The Imaginary Kid. When I was about 11 years old, my dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot from place to place. I hardly ever had the chance to make friends, especially when we were constantly moving from state to state. We finally settled into a neighborhood. I would ride my bike around the block and basically would try to find something to do. One day, I was riding my bike and there was this kid that was standing on the sidewalk. Something drew me to him. I pulled my bike up to the sidewalk and he smiled and introduced himself. He said his name was Jack. We made friends very quickly. I asked him where he lived and he pointed to the house right behind him and he told me that's where he lived. It was a really big house and it looked really old and Victorian-like. He lived about 10 or 11 houses away from my house. I started going over to his house a lot and we would always play outside. He would never let me inside his house. I would always bring my toys because he never had anything to play with. Even when I brought my toys, he would never want to pick them up or play with them. He would always use his own hands. There were many times that we played cops and robbers or cowboys and Indians, and he would be excited about me bringing my toys over. But again, he never picked them up. I decided not to make a big deal about it because he was a really cool friend. Everything came crashing down one day. One hot day, while we were playing outside, I got really hot and thirsty, and I asked him if there's anything that I could drink, even a glass of water from his house. He said there's no way he can get it for me. I asked him why, and he said because there's just no way that he can get me a glass of water. I remember getting really upset and asking him why can't he just ask his mom if I can get a glass of water. Again, he said no, I just can't. I remember at that point getting extremely upset. That's when I jumped on my bike and I left him there, and I remember riding back home. A couple of weeks went by without me playing with him. It came to a point to where I got really bored one day, and I got on my bike and I remember riding down the sidewalk. That's when I passed by his house and he was standing outside, smiling and waving. I pulled up to him and told him that I was really sorry for what happened, and I'm sorry for getting upset. That's when he told me that it was okay, and he wasn't mad, and that he found something he wanted to show me, and he's been wanting to show me for the past week. I was pretty surprised, and I followed him to his backyard where he told me to follow him. He pointed to an axe on the ground, and it was covered in dirt. He asked me to pick up the axe, that it was a really cool axe. So I went ahead and I got the axe and I pulled it out of the dirt. He then pointed over to a log that was on the ground and he said, "I want you to hit this log with this axe." I was confused. I didn't know why he wanted me to do this. I told him no. I tried to hand him the axe, but he refused and said I cannot pick up the axe. Again, I told him to hit the log with the axe. He started to get upset. So, after a while, I told him okay, that I would do it. I finally gave in to him. I raised the axe in the air, and after counting down from 3 to 1, I hit the log. Just then, a piece of wood flew in the air and went right into my eye. All I remember is feeling a sharp pain in my right eye. I dropped the axe and I began screaming and running to my bike. He began laughing really loud. I got on my bike and quickly went home, But the scariest part of this whole story is, while I was riding my bike all the way home, I heard him laughing right behind my right ear. After 7 surgeries, I'm still blind for my right eye. Later on, as time went on, I finally thought about it and put the pieces together. The boy Jack that I made friends with was not a human. He was indeed a ghost. Not only did I never see his parents, but he never allowed me into his house. I also remember now that he wore the same clothes every day. And on top of that, he never picked up anything with his bare hands.
Story number 3, the entity under the car. In 1990, me and my family went on vacation to visit family in Mexico. While we were there, we went shopping and visited some friends and family members. We spent about 4 days over there, and we were finally heading back to Texas. I remember we filled up our gas tank and started our drive back home. But after being on the road for just about an hour, we got a flat tire. Luckily, we had a spare in the back. So after fixing the tire, we continued on our way back home. But after another hour, we got a second flat. That's when we had to drive on this flat until we finally made it to a tire shop. As soon as we made it into the tire shop, our car completely stalled out. It did not want to start. My dad got off the car and went into the tire shop to ask them to please fix our car. When we came back out of the tire shop, there was an old man smoking a cigar sitting outside in a chair. He told my dad there's something he really needed to tell him. Skeptical, my dad and I wanted to hear what the man had to say. The old man said that there's a demon hanging under our car and that it was looking right at us. I remember getting chills all over my body. The old man said that there's a reason why our car was breaking down, that we must have bought something and it was haunting us, and it was probably cursed. So me and my dad went back to the car. We opened the trunk of the car, and that's when my dad pulled out an old hat that we had bought from a woman on the side of the road. When my dad looked closely at the hat, he noticed that there was dried blood inside of the hat. We quickly threw the hat away in the trash. After doing that, we had no more problems on our way back home. To this day, I think that that hat was cursed because someone must have died in it. And that's the reason why there was a demon following us the whole way. It wasn't until we threw away that hat that we were able to make it safely back home to Texas. Thank you for listening to Master of Horror, where I bring you the scariest paranormal stories that I've ever come by. If you liked what you've heard, please like and subscribe so I can continue to give you more paranormal stories. Thank you again, my friends. Until next time, good night. And don't forget to leave the nightlight on.
My clairvoyance.
I am a 27-year-old female, and ever since I was a little girl, I've been able to see things that others can't. Whenever someone tells you something like that, it most likely means that they probably had a hard time growing up. Children with this gift simply don't understand their sensitivity to energies and how to safeguard against them. Having parents that are either closed off to the paranormal or simply won't accept it can even be harder. I shared that information with you to illustrate that this encounter wasn't my first experience with ghosts or entities. I was a teenager back then, and I was hanging out with my then good-for-nothing boyfriend. I don't remember what we were talking about when the topic got brought up, but he said, "I don't know what happened here before we moved in, but this place is definitely haunted, babe. I always get this creeped out feeling when I'm upstairs, like somebody's watching me." I never really talked to my ex about my gift with the paranormal, so I was a bit intrigued when he said this. After showing me around the house, I could sense the spirit wandering in the upstairs hallway before it disappeared in the bedroom. The second time I encountered this so-called spirit was the night of his sister's baby shower. His family came traveling in from far away that night. A fight had broke out because they had a disagreement and couldn't work things out. At that time, I walked upstairs and grabbed something from the bedroom. The upstairs hallway light was off because the bulb kept burning out. Every time it would get replaced, the bulb would wind up blowing out days after. Due to it not being replaced, I had to use my phone's flashlight to get around. I got what I came for and was heading back towards the stairwell when all of a sudden I got this feeling that I was being watched by something very angry. I stopped for a moment, looking back down the hallway, trying to tell if I was just being paranoid or something was actually there. Then, out of the shadows, an angry-looking man came charging right at me. Now, I pride myself in not being easily scared, but at that moment, I took off. I knew that what I saw was 100% paranormal. The man I saw looked like he was incomplete. He was missing pieces from his face with other parts blurred out. This ghostly man must have been angry about something. All that built up negative energy can be very dangerous even to somebody like me, who can see the paranormal with no problems at all. I could have just forgot about it, but I told myself that the apparition appeared because of all the fighting that occurred downstairs when his family came over that one night. This was the first time in a very long time that I had seen anything that frightened me. A few nights later, I showed up at my ex-boyfriend's house and once again found myself at the top of the stairs looking down. His bedroom is also located in the hallway, so as I walked to the door, I noticed that the bathroom light was on. It wasn't uncommon for him to leave the light on, but the door was also slightly cracked, casting a triangular shape on the carpet. I then saw something standing there, which blocked the light coming through. At first, I thought it was my boyfriend, so I opened the door. At first, I thought it was him, so I opened the door. My happy smile quickly faded. I realized no one was there. I ran to the bedroom and opened his door. There was my ex on his bed, on his phone. He said, "Let me guess, you saw something in the bathroom, just like I did." He told me the night prior, after leaving the restroom, the door made a noise. When he turned around, he saw that the restroom door had closed all the way by itself. When he opened it, he saw an apparition standing looking at itself in the mirror. It then slowly turned towards him. He exclaims that it was a man, an older man, who looked really angry. He bolted to his bedroom, closed the door, and eventually forgot about it. We eventually went about our night, but I couldn't get over what I saw that night. My ex and I weren't together much longer after that night, and his family never came by to visit that house. I've been told by two different psychics that I have a dark entity attached to me, following me wherever I go. After the breakup, a lot of things in my life changed. I've always wondered if whatever was inside his house attached itself to me. But who really knows? Whenever I'm alone, I can feel the ghostly entity staring at me. I don't know who he was, but I have an idea that he was a miserable man when he was alive, full of hate and anger. What's left of him now tries to torment anyone who crosses his path. But again, that's just my thoughts. I've seen his face so many times that I can accurately draw him on a piece of paper. I plan on talking to someone who knows the history of this town and perhaps can help me find out who exactly this ghostly entity was.
Scary, true paranormal story number 2. My grandfather.
Hi, my mother told me this true story. She said in 2004, my grandfather passed away from lung cancer, which devastated the whole family, especially my grandmother. I was only a few months old at the time of his passing, so I never got to know him, but I've always heard stories about him from various relatives. They said while he was alive, he was a good man. A few weeks after the funeral, my mother had been driving back home from the store with my older brother in the car, who was 3 years old at the time. As they were on their way back home, my brother said out of nowhere, "Mommy, I saw Grandpa." This caught her off guard, and all she could do was listen. Grandpa was in my room. My mother remained silent the rest of the way home. I don't think she believed him at first. A few months later, she was in the living room, while I was on the floor playing with my toys. My mother went into the kitchen to grab a snack for me. A few seconds later, she heard me giggling. Stepping back into the room, she playfully asked me, "What are you laughing about, honey?" What she saw, however, made her pause. I was still laughing while my hands were in the air, as if someone was going to pick me up, but nobody was there. My mom quickly scooped me up in her arms and took me to the kitchen. The last occurrence happened a year later. My grandmother had been staying with us for a few weeks, and at one point, my grandfather was brought up into the conversation, and my grandmother began to cry. She was still having it hard, coping with his death. My brother, who at this time was 4 years old, told my grandmother, "Grandpa said that everything will be okay." So this compelled my mother to rush down the hallway to my brother's room to see who may be in there that he's been talking to. She swears up and down as she entered the room, a dark, ghostly figure was standing in his room, surrounded by a strange light. When my mother called out for us to come in the room to look at the figure, and the light vanished from plain sight. When she got back to the kitchen, she tried to explain that nothing was wrong. She didn't want to upset my grandmother even more. There were no further occurrences after that day. To this day, my mother is convinced that the spirit of her father was watching over us until my grandmother finally accepted his passing over. The entity in the doorway. When I was about 19 years old, I went to visit my girlfriend Valerie. One night, it actually got pretty late, around 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock a.m. So that's when her parents decided to let me spend the night, but only if we promised not to lock the bedroom door, since we weren't married yet. She lived in a 2-bedroom, small, older house. There was a hallway in between both rooms with the restroom in the middle. We got ready to go to sleep, and I made my bed on the floor while Val was going to sleep in her own bed. I was laying on the floor right next to Val, with my head about a foot away from the bedroom door. After we pillow talked for about an hour, I noticed that she started to fall asleep. That's when I decided to go to sleep, and I began to slowly doze off. That's when I heard someone walking in the hallway towards the bedroom we were sleeping in. It was pitch dark in the room. They didn't have carpet in the room. Rather, it was wood panel floors, so I could hear the floor creaking. I figured it must be her parents checking to make sure we were not sleeping in the same bed together. Then the doorknob slowly turned and the door opened with a creaking noise. I kept my eyes closed, hoping that her parents would leave once they saw that I was asleep on the floor. I was surprised when the door stayed open. Whoever it was, or whatever it was only inches away from my head. I was beginning to get worried and confused because whoever it was not leaving the doorway. I felt as if I was being watched. When 10 minutes passed, that's when I could no longer fake my sleep. I was beginning to truly get scared. Then something happened that I will never forget till this day. I heard a low, long growl. I could feel my heart beating through my body. The room got extremely cold at that moment. Then finally, after about 15 minutes of torture, the bedroom door slowly shut. It took me about an hour or so just to fall asleep. The following morning, I asked Valerie's parents if they checked on us the previous night, and they said they never left their bedroom. That's when I got goosebumps all over my body, and I knew it was something paranormal. To this very day, I cannot explain what happened that night, and what made that growl, and what was it doing the whole time it was standing in the doorway. Scary, true, paranormal story number 2, chased by a UFO. In 1965, me and my father were coming home from our Wednesday church service. We were driving down a long stretch of road. We were headed to our house in the country area. It was about 10 o'clock p.m. We were pretty tired and were just trying to make it home. While we were driving, I happened to look up and noticed a flickering red and yellow light in the sky. I looked harder, and that's when I noticed it was slowly moving. It was about 2 miles away or so. I showed my dad, and he gazed up at it, and we were wondering what it could be. I told him it looked like a UFO. That's when it quickly vanished. But about 5 minutes later, while we were driving on the same road, we noticed the same light flickering, but this time it was in the middle of the road. I couldn't believe my eyes what I was seeing. It was just sitting there. As we drove closer, our jaws dropped in amazement because it was clear to us that it was an actual UFO. A real UFO with the brightest lights I've ever seen, circling around the spacecraft. We were parked there in front of the UFO, not moving at all. I told my dad, what do we do? Because it was literally blocking us from getting to our house. After sitting there for a couple of minutes and not saying anything, my father did the unthinkable, something that I will never forget to this day. He slammed on the gas straight towards the UFO. The car went full throttle and drove straight towards the spacecraft that was just sitting there in the middle of the road. I thought we were going to crash and die. Just seconds before hitting the UFO, it launched up in the air and took off. I do not know why my dad did what he did. The truth is, we could have literally died that night. As we were racing home and were almost about 2 minutes away from our house, we noticed the same UFO popped up right behind us and was following us. Then it took off in front of us and left us behind. As soon as we made it home, we noticed the UFO was hovering right above our house. We were wondering, how did the UFO know that we live there? Even though we lived in the country, there were other houses in the area. My dad told me to stay in the car. As he got out of the car, he slammed the door and ran into the house to get his gun. I was petrified as I was staring up at the UFO. While my dad was inside the house, I rolled down my window and I looked around, and that's when I saw 3 or 4 human-like creatures standing around the bushes that surrounded our house. My father came outside with his rifle and started shooting at the UFO. That's when I got out of the car and told him that there were creatures around the bushes that surrounded our house. While my father was still shooting at the UFO, it flew directly up into the air and vanished. We rushed inside and locked the doors. My father called the sheriff's department to tell them what had just happened that night. But that same night, we had to make a statement on what happened regarding the UFO. To this day, I do not know why the UFO chose to mess with us. At night, I always wonder, what if those creatures would have gotten a hold of us? Or what if the UFO would have actually attacked us? This I may never ever know. Scary True Paranormal Story number 3. The Club. This story is one of my own, and it is a very scary, true story. My dad told me this a long time ago, and this story has never left my mind, as it is one of the scariest things I have ever heard. This took place in Corpus Christi, Texas in the 1950s. My dad said his dad, my grandpa, played accordion as a side job and was pretty good at it. He was outside his house playing the accordion around evening time when a man came by and introduced himself as John. He said he was in a band and played nightly at a nightclub in Corpus Christi. He said that my grandfather played really good accordion music and it sounded really nice. He wanted to know if my grandpa wanted to come out to the nightclub the following night and that he would also get paid for it. My grandfather was really excited about the job offer and agreed to it right away. The man told him to make sure he's there at 2 a.m. sharp. My grandfather found it pretty strange that he had to be there at the club so late, but he didn't ask any questions. The following night, my grandfather showed up to the dance hall exactly at 2 a.m. He was dressed really nice and had his accordion strapped around him. He said that as soon as he walked into the nightclub, he felt a strange, weird feeling as if everyone was looking at him. Everyone was dressed in suits and tuxedos. Music was playing and everyone was drinking and having a really good time dancing. He made his way to the side of the stage, and there he saw John, the man that invited him to come to the club. John saw my grandfather and walked up to him and asked him if he knew what song they were playing at the moment. My grandfather said yes, he did know the song and knew how to play it. So my grandfather got on stage and began to play his accordion. But he said about after 2 minutes of playing the song, he noticed that something didn't look right with John, the singer that was on stage at the time. He looked down at John's feet while he was singing, and to his shock and horror, John had goat feet. After seeing this, his whole body went cold. He quickly looked at the other band members and noticed that they had chicken feet. He stopped playing the accordion and looked around at the people dancing, and they all had animal feet and legs. Some people had goat feet, while others had chicken and pig feet. My grandfather was petrified. He couldn't move. Just then, he said the music stopped and everyone noticed that he knew how they looked. Everyone stopped dancing and they all stopped moving. They all looked at him with straight, serious faces. That's when he jumped off the stage and ran towards the door. He said he could hear everyone laughing at him. He finally made it out of the dance hall and ran all the way straight home. When he got home, he told my grandmother everything that had happened to him. The following morning, he went back to the club with some friends to show them where all this took place, and to his surprise and horror, the doors and windows were boarded up. The place looked run down and was falling apart. My grandfather was confused. He later found out that there was a fire years prior that burned down the dance hall, taking the lives of everyone that was there that dreadful night. I grew up with my parents separated. I would have to go back and forth between my mom and dad's house. My mom lived in a small town in Nebraska. It was a 2-story house. My dad was super sick, so my twin brother and I went to go stay with my mother until he recovered. I didn't have a bedroom of my own. My brother Thomas and I had to share a room upstairs with my half-brother Greg. My mom and stepfather stayed in the master bedroom down the hall. Rather than share a room with my brothers, I decided to sleep downstairs on the living room couch. One night during the summer, we got home late. Everyone was getting ready for bed, and I settled down on the couch and I waited for everyone to go into their room so I could finally get some rest. I eventually dozed off. I woke up in the middle of the night and it felt like I was being pulled up from the couch. Panic took over. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed as if a heavy weight was on top of my chest. As I struggled in vain, a cold hand covered my mouth and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I felt myself slipping away. Suddenly, the weight lifted, and I shot up off the couch and took a deep gasping breath. After composing myself, I began to cry until I fell back to sleep. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. For all I knew, it was just a violent nightmare. Now, fast forward a few months later, and we were having a really bad storm. I listened to the rain as it hit the AC unit outside the living room. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was beginning to drift off. From my position on the couch, I could see the kitchen. There was a small sunroom with our washer and dryer next to the back door. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I could see something darting back and forth between the kitchen and the sunroom. It was a dark mass that almost resembled a human, but it had a transparent body.
It was pacing between the sunroom and the kitchen really quick, as if it was looking for something. I laid there, as still as a statue, watching this thing go back and forth. I slowly pulled the covers up to the bridge of my nose, terrified to take my eyes away from the figure. 5 minutes go by, and it just vanishes into thin air. To get to the stairwell from downstairs, you have to go through the kitchen, and even with that thing being gone, I wasn't going to take my chances of trying to go up the stairs and wake up my mom. I ended up pulling the covers completely over my head and fell back to sleep. The next morning, I questioned everyone in the house if they were awake the night before, walking around downstairs. My mother just shrugged it off and assumed that I had a really bad nightmare. Not much happened after that. However, my mother ended up passing away. My father was still very sick at the time, so Thomas and I had to stay with my grandmother for the time being. After my mother's funeral, we moved from Nebraska to Iowa to stay with my aunt. As if the story couldn't get any more tragic, my dad succumbed to his illness and passed away as well. My stepdad was still living in the same house, and we got to see him from time to time. Whenever we would come visit, the strange occurrences began happening all over again. Maybe it was just all the grief, but that place seemed darker than ever before, and it felt like something was constantly looking over my shoulder watching me. We stayed the night with my stepfather during Christmas vacation. Before my mom passed away, she bought a massage chair. It was very comfortable, and I slept in it the first night back. My brother and stepdad stayed awake playing games all night. After a while, Thomas shook me awake. His eyes were huge and his face was completely drained of color. I asked him, "What the hell's going on?" He said, "Natalie, listen. I was playing on the computer and I looked over and I saw your hair. It was floating in the air as if someone was holding it. As soon as I noticed it, your hair just fell straight down." When my brother said this, I felt my blood turn to ice. I got out of the chair and shared the couch with my brother that night, but I couldn't sleep all night. We ended up going back to my grandmother's the following day. Later on, when we went back to visit, my stepdad and uncle were cleaning up the front yard, and they found one of my old teddy bears buried under some leaves. They decided to wash it up and give it back to me because the bear was a gift from my mother. She bought it for me many years ago. I was so happy to have it back, even though the button didn't work anymore. I would still press the button multiple times a day, hoping and praying that it would work again. My stepdad drove us back to my grandma's. When we got there, he opened the trunk to grab our bags. That's when the bear activated and began playing its little tune again. I couldn't believe it. The tune started off with its original slow tune. However, as it went on, it became a distorted drowning sound. It slowed down and then eventually stopped. It was creepy, but I brushed it off thinking that it was just the old damaged wiring. However, the bear would turn on and off for the rest of that night, playing the same drowning slow tune. During the early hours of the morning, I was laying in bed when I heard a crackling voice coming from the teddy bear. To my horror and surprise, it said my name. The very next morning, I tossed it into the garbage. My stepfather ended up being deported back to the UK, and we never returned to that house again. After that, it would eventually be torn down years later, and I was happy to see it go. I really wish that was the end of the story, but sadly, it isn't to this day. I still have horrible nightmares about the house. I sometimes dream about being back there, alone in the dark. I make my way up the stairs and stand in the doorway to the bathroom and stare into the vanity mirror. Everything starts to feel heavy, and I begin to cry for my mother. An apparition that looks like my mother appears in the mirror, smiling at me. Its smile then unnaturally begins to extend from ear to ear. The eyes then turn black, and then I hear its disturbing voice say, "You'll never get away from me. Never." That's when I wake up. I just wish I could forget about that haunted house, bury it in the past, and move on with my life. But it will forever live on in my nightmares. Paranormal True Scary Story number 2. This happened back in 2007. I was around 9 years old. I had never really experienced anything that could be considered a paranormal encounter in my house. But on one lonely night, that would all change. It was around midnight when I happened to wake up. As usual, my bedroom door was open with the hallway light turned on. When I looked over, I saw something. There was a dark, faceless figure looming in the corner of my room. I really didn't know what to think or do. As weird as it sounds, I really didn't feel scared at first. I was more curious than anything. The tall figure continued to linger and just stared at me. Looking back, I can honestly say that I wasn't experiencing some kind of sleep paralysis. This seemed far too real to even be a dream. I decided to slowly turn around and face the wall. I just covered myself up with a blanket and closed my eyes. The next morning, I knew it was morning. I decided not to tell my parents about the dark figure. They were some pretty hardcore Christians and honestly didn't want to freak them out. I eventually did tell my mother about it. Luckily, she took it pretty well. Instead of flipping out on me, she told me that she had also witnessed something similar. Her encounter was much more disturbing than mine. According to her, a tall dark figure also appeared to her in the middle of the night. My father remained asleep. Suddenly, the towering figure moved in and began to choke her. She began to pray, and the dark figure eventually loosened its grip and backed away, and soon it disappeared. It was only after it was gone that my father woke up. Personally, I think the entity also attacked me as well, but in a different way, because ever since its appearance, terrible things have happened to me over the years. I am now 23 years old, and I still live in that same haunted house. Thankfully, I have never experienced anything like that ever since, and I can only speculate as to what the dark tall figure was and what its intentions were. True, scary, paranormal story number 3. Hi, I'll start off by saying that I don't live with my family. I'm currently renting a house a half a mile away from them. My mom and my brother live in a subdivision, and my dad is currently working abroad. My brother has a mental disorder, which can make him unpredictable sometimes, and he's still in high school, which also further complicates things. So last year, when my family moved into that house, my mother began experiencing unnatural things. Before she moved in, Mom decided to visit and clean up the house with 2 of her acquaintances. While they were cleaning up, they found these weird red triangle stickers placed above each door. At first, they left it off. However, my mother suspected that something wasn't quite right. When the stickers were removed, she had this inexplicable feeling that they were making a big mistake. The ceiling fans began to turn on and off by themselves. One of my mother's friends was an experienced painter, and he was left alone to paint the walls while my mom went for a food run. She knocked on the door when she got back, but no one answered. She then texted him to let him know that she was outside. Suddenly, she received a reply that just said, "Wait." My mom was taken back by the rude and abrupt message, but she figured that he may have been in the bathroom or something. After a couple of minutes, she knocked on the door again, and her friend eventually opened the door. When it came time to leave, she casually asked her friend if he didn't hear her when she knocked on the door earlier, and she mentioned the text message that he had sent. Her friend insisted that he had never sent a text message and that he couldn't even hear her knocking the first time because he was blasting music from his phone. This gave my mother the creeps. The next occurrence happened right after the house was done being remodeled. My mother, along with a coworker of hers, arrived at the house, and they couldn't open the door. They both pushed on the door as hard as they could, when suddenly there came 3 knocks from the other side of the front door. They forced the door open somehow, and they searched the entire house, but no one was there. We found out from some neighbors that the family who lived there before didn't stay there very long either, because of a series of bizarre and inexplainable occurrences. After my mom and brother moved in, the supernatural events just worsened. There have been numerous attempts to deal with these restless spirits in the house, even inviting some local pastors over to bless the home. I was, and am still worried about my wayward brother. Whatever resides in that house has seemed to take a special interest in him. He can hear his name being called out, beckoning to him. This is still an ongoing occurrence. I'll list some of the other things that they have been experiencing. Household items are moved around, faucets are turned on and off, lights flicker uncontrollably, random knocking can be heard on the roof, and scratch marks have appeared on the walls. My mother has reached her breaking point and plans on moving out of that hell house. I just hope it's not too late for them. Their departure may trigger whatever is targeting my brother. It might just stop toying with him and finally make its move.